Snow lay across the eaves like a slow, careful breath, softening the edges of the roof until the inn seemed to hover between two seasons. From the bathhouse behind the house came a steady, gentle steam that rose and vanished into the falling cold. The onsen drew the night's chill into itself and returned a warmened fog that wrapped the lane in a hush. Inside, a pair of lanterns threw low pools of light, amber on paper and wood. The innkeeper moved between them with small, precise gestures, the kind learned by doing the same work 1,000 evenings, lifting a kettle to listen for its thin song, turning a wick so it would not smoke, checking that the futons were folded with the same neatness someone might use to fold a letter. She ran her thumb along the noren at the doorway, a length of fabric, faded at the bottom where hands and weather had rubbed it thin. The rip had been there since summer, a clean, honest tear that had only widened with time, a small fissure that made the threshold look confessed. The thread at the hem was worn to a whisper. She felt it, the give under her nail, and the house made a response of creaks and soft settling, as if to acknowledge that things loosen and must be tended. Her cat came and sat at her feet, tail curled like a question mark. It had the inn's patience in its bones. It watched the innkeeper with indifferent appraisal, then blinked and went back to sleep where the lantern light warmed the grain of the floor. She set a hand on the Ngawa's lower rail. There was a softness there, a cup in the plank where winter's damp had taken hold. Not catastrophic, no word for alarm. Simply a plank that would no longer sing when walked. There are small failures a house permits, and there are the ones that call neighbors. She hummed a chord under her breath as she gathered the necessities. A skein of waxed linen thread, an oiled thimble tucked into a pocket, a length of thin oak left over from the carpenter's last job, planks for mending, a tin of brass rings polished by the neighbor with oddments, and a small pot of paste made from rice starch the elder had left that morning. The brazier by the hearth held the last of its coal in dull orange eyes, dying embers that would either be coaxed into life or smothered for the night. She brought them to the table, arranging tools the way a person arranges their thoughts. A plane, a mallet, a hollow punch, a small anvil the blacksmith lent when heavy work was required. Outside, the lane smelled of snow and the damp iron tang that comes when cold meets warm wood. The blacksmith's forge was a short walk from the inn, a humble shed that blurred into the lacquered dark. When he came, he did not stride like a hero from the stories. He walked with the calm step of someone who works with hours rather than with deeds. He carried a small bucket of coal, his palms carrying the memory of heat even as the air took it from him. The smell of warmed metal and coal followed him like a second shadow. He set the bucket by the brazier, unrolled a scrap of cloth, and wiped his hands as if to remove the day's work, though the hands themselves told their own stories. Calluses at the base of the thumb, the thin lines where steel had kissed skin. He smiled when the innkeeper offered him tea, and there was a brief exchange. Words about the work to be done, a tilt of the head toward the noren, a glance at the Ngawa rail. He placed a small leather bag on the table and drew from it a strip of brass rings, burnished to the faintest blush. He had made them from an old kettle once, he said, apologizing for their origin as if scrap could be an offense. Around the table, the apprentices found places and hands that belonged to the house by habit. A young woman with ink under her nails who practiced her stitching quietly. Another apprentice, slightly older, more careful with blade, who checked plain blades as reverently as a cook checks a favorite pan. The elder arrived exactly when she would. carrying a jar of pickled vegetables wrapped in brown paper, smelling faintly of miso and the summer sun that had dried them. He moved with a stooped steadiness that came from years of doing and knowing when to speak and when to be quiet. He set down the jar and said, without preface, "A house is like a seam. If you leave the raw edge to fray, it will show. There was no ceremony to the gathering." The neighbor with oddments produced his tin of fasteners, brass grommets and odd plates filed into soft rectangles, while the gardener left a small bundle of greens on the table, a barter of taste for the labor they expected to share. A child who had been sent to bed curiously pressed a nose to the shoji, listening to the scratch of plane and the quiet conversations of adults. The innkeeper handed the apprentices the waxed thread, guiding their fingers at first and then letting them practice. Their stitches looked like tentative footfalls at the edge of a trail, small, careful, soon to find rhythm. "If this quiet evening suits you, stay a little longer." They began where all good mending begins, with choice. A torn panel cannot be healed merely by hurried stitches any more than a wounded hand can be soothed by a single bandage. The old Norrin would need visible repair, the kind that honors the fabric's history rather than pretending it had not been used. They laid it flat across the table. Under the lamp, the pattern, subtle indigo, faded flowers, looked like a memory come awake. The tier was along the smoking side where travelers once wiped their boots. Its edges were clean rather than ragged, as if someone had paused, perhaps years ago, and thought, "I will leave this to mend properly some day." The apprentices measured and marked with short, precise strokes. They chose washi for patches, a paper thin yet fibrous, strong when pasted and kind to fabric. The elder, from his pocket, produced a strip of linen, patched from a former curtain, and handed it to the younger apprentice with a quiet, "Keep the repair honest. Let the join tell its own story." His voice was gravelly but soft. His advice was a small map for craftsmanship. At the brazier, the blacksmith unfastened the tin of brass rings and showed them how a grommet might be set without tearing the fabric anew. He warmed the rings against the coals until they hummed faintly with heat, a small, humming thing not unlike the inside of a throat. He used tongs to hold one, set it upon an anvil the innkeeper had dragged from the back shed, and tapped the setter with a mallet. The strike was a clear note that seemed to steady the room, the metallic kiss that says, "Now we shape." The apprentice watched the ring deform and seat itself against the fabric. When cooled, the brass would not cut away with use. It would be a little addition that said, "This place has been mended with attention." The plank on the Ngawa demanded a different kind of humility. It was not a rupture to be patched in place, but a tiredness. The lower rail had lost the tautness that once kept rain from creeping beneath the threshold. The innkeeper fetched a plane and a shaving board, and together they measured a replacement strip from the oak. The smell of cut timber, green sweet with a hint of old varnish, rose as the plane bit into the grain. The shavings lay like pale ribbons across the floor, and the apprentice learned to hold the plane in the way that made the blade sing, to take only what was needed. Small corrections were offered in minimal words. "Too much at the edge," the blacksmith said once, not condescending, merely observant. He had the patience of someone who had been wrong more times than most, and had learned how to notice the moment before a mistake. He set the plank in place, tested it with the flat of his palm, and tapped it with a mallet so it would seat without splitting. He did not boast of skill. His work was an exchange of breath and muscle with timber and steel. Throughout the evening there was talk. Practical, the sort that settles a room. The elder told them about a neighbor's lantern that once hung crooked for a fortnight. The gardener recalled a time when a futon had been restitched so badly it had made the bed lopsided. There were laughs, like soft cloth being snapped. The apprentices practiced knots and stitches, their fingers tightening and loosening as they found muscle memory. The house listened. It made small noises, settling its weight around them. Steam brushed the windows from the onsen like a hand passing and left ghosted circles on the glass. Occasionally, the blacksmith would step outside, opening the shed door a crack to feed the little forge. He breathed the coal into glow, coaxing the dying embers into a bright eye. Once alight, the forge warmed the small room through the open shutter with a generosity that was not all heat. There was also a smell of iron and hearth sweat, an ancient perfume that told of work and repair. He heated a length of wire to make a hook, simple, useful, then quenched it in a wooden pail. The hiss was a private applause, and the wire bowed like a heated reed. He set the hook into a frame and hammered the eye until it curved smooth. At some point, the apprentices began to speak of things other than what they were doing, a way of mending that was faster but less beautiful, a tune they had heard the blacksmith whistle on his walk. These small confessions made the room larger. They folded ordinary life into workmanship. The innkeeper watched them with a smile that was both indulgent and exacting. She corrected a folded fringe here, suggested a stitch there. Her hands were like a teacher's hand that lets go when the pupil is ready. The Norin's patched face grew in a series of deliberate acts. They chose to let the patch sit across the tear visibly, not to hide, because to hide was to deny use. The elder told a story of a dress button, replaced with a silver coin when the seamstress had no matching material, and the coin had become a keepsake, a small star of its own. The apprentices sewed, the blacksmith set grommets, and the elder pasted washi in the neat, patient way of someone who had repaired jars for decades. Night deepened outside. Lantern light made the paper glow like contained sun. The onsen's steam thinned and became threadbare, and the snow, having paused as if to listen, resumed its falling. The brazier's embers breathed slower. Pieces of coal lay quietly, their faces lined with ash. The blacksmith scraped his hands with a cloth, the skin under his nails dark as the seams of the road. The younger apprentice had finished a neat row of visible stitches, and held the needle up to the light, pleased with how the thread caught. The older apprentice, who had been plane shaving, presented a plank whose end fit the frame like a promise. They paused sometimes to drink something hot. Green tea poured into small cups that steamed in cupped hands, the heat moving from vessel to palm to chest. The elder tapped his cup, and, as if reading the innkeeper's mood rather than the object, said, "There is worth in labor that keeps the house honest." He did not preach. He stated it like one might state an ingredient. The work itself was the sermon. At the side of the room the cat rearranged itself, finding a warmer circle and, as if to participate in the ritual, began to purr, a soft motor that became a thin undercurrent to the noises of repair. The house accepted its sounds and, in return, offered warmth. An apprentice looked up and, having grown used to the sound of hammers hitting iron, marveled at how a mallet on oak sounded like a heartbeat. The blacksmith showed them a small trick with the grommet setter. When the metal was given a brief, even warmth, it bent more obediently and set more cleanly around the fabric. He did not heat it red, no dramatic flare, but a patient heat until the brass had an agreeable softness. He held the ring in tongs, set the Norrin over a block of wood, and with the smooth face of the hammer closed the grommet. The sound was the same as before, but softer now. The ring did its work, and the fabric kept its dignity. Hours passed as though in chapters within a single evening. The innkeeper stepped outside to fetch more coal, and saw the small forge's glow stride into the lane like a second hearth. The lanterns in the windows of other houses winked. Someone else was likely settling their own small failures for the night. A child banged a wooden toy on the step and was shushed gently by a parent. Such domestic punctuation reminded them all of the reasons for mending. There were moments when the apprentices asked questions not about technique, but about waiting. How long until work was considered done, when a person knew they had practiced enough? The elder answered with an aphorism that had the weight of the river. When you can make something hold, and you know why it will hold, then you may call it finished. The blacksmith nodded, and without pressing a moral, added, "And when you can do it again for a neighbor without being asked, then it is a part of you." When their hands were tired, and the Norrin's face was patched into a quiet dignity, the innkeeper pushed at the lower plank on the Ngawa. It held more firmly now, the replacement fitted and smoothed so that the foot was ushered across it without complaint. The apprentices tested it by walking the length of the Ngawa, listening for the precise note they had set into it. It gave a small, contented creak that was the sound of a thing restored to its purpose. They were not finished. There were always more small things to be done, buttons to replace, crusts to mend. But the heavy tasks of this evening were in hand. The elder set out the pickles and a small ceramic of rice for the simple supper that had been waiting while the work was done. The blacksmith removed his apron and sat, ridges of soot showing beneath his nails like faint constellation maps. The apprentices had flour on their palms and a faint shine of oil where they had handled tools. They looked up at the table as if seeing their labors transformed into a meal was a final hallowing. They ate with the kind of silence that is full of conversation. A look, a nod, a half-laugh when someone pointed out that the cat had taken the best piece. The elder cleared his throat and recited a short, old line about how food tasted better in the company of work. No one argued. Outside, wind brushed the eaves and the sound of distant bells came across the hot spring's fog. A soft rim of sound that marked the passing hour but did not hurry them. After supper, the blacksmith rose and, taking up the anvil, began the small, deliberate task of finishing the hooks that would support the Norrin's wooden rod. He bent wire and hammered the curve until the steel sang exactly as it should. The song was a series of modest notes that made the room listen. He set each hook in a neat row and presented them to the innkeeper, who threaded them along the rod and tested the balance. The Norrin hung as it had always hung, but now with the visible scar sewn into it like a seam that told of use and care rather than neglect. There remained, though, one thing they had chosen to postpone. A full replacement of the lower support of the Ngawa where the ground had settled more than they'd first thought. The mortar beneath the post had softened, and although the plank fit well enough now, the innkeeper could not ignore the feeling that the post needed a firmer foundation. They laid the tools aside with a mutual agreement. Not resignation, but a plan. The work would be finished in the morning when daylight and more hands would make the task safer and truer. A thin hush took hold after the meal. The apprentices curled on the futon set in the corner, speaking in whispers that were half questions about what they had learned. The blacksmith rinsed his hands in a basin, and then, as if by habit, took a small corner of the coal life and set one ember into a metal cup that stood like an offering. He cradled it, warming his fingers. "Dying embers are only waiting for patience," he said to no one in particular, and the words rested on the air like a small benediction. The brazier's glow deepened its color, and then dimmed as the night drew on. It was then, with the house soft and its occupants close to sleep or the verge of it, that a gentle knock came at the sliding door. The sound was polite and small, knuckles on wood, not unlike a tap from a walking stick. It made the cat look up. It made the elder straighten. The innkeeper folded her hands and rose, smoothing the hem of her apron as if by that small motion she could announce to the night that things here were steady. She moved to the Norrin and pushed gently aside. At the doorway stood a stranger. He was wrapped in a cloak flecked with snow, his cheeks reddened by the cold and by travel. He carried nothing more than a small, wet parcel tied with twine. His eyes were not wide with drama, but with a kind of honest fatigue. Someone who had walked a long way and simply needed a place to be warm. He did not ask for much. His voice was low and careful when he spoke, as if the night deserved subdued words. The innkeeper listened, her face a map of small, immediate judgments. She looked at the stranger, then at the Norrin, then at the blacksmith's hands where a faint smudge of ash still marked the crease of his thumb. She let the inner economy of the house unfold in her head. The futon already laid, the kettle warm, the brazier still breathing, the plank not yet fully bedded in its foundation, and made the decision with the same unceremonious certainty as one might choose a tool. "Come in," she said, and the word was both an invitation and a promise of work yet to be finished. The stranger stepped across the threshold with the hesitant gratitude of someone arriving at the end of a road. The cat sniffed and decided he was acceptable. The apprentices watched from the corner as if auditioning for what hospitality should look like. They would share supper, of course. A private plate set across the table, a futon offered, a bowl of hot tea. The blacksmith, already near the brazier, moved as though to set another coal. The elder placed the jar of pickles within reach of the newcomer. The innkeeper wrapped the stranger's parcel and placed it on the low shelf, noting its smallness and the care with which it had been tied. She thought, not unkindly, that the parcel looked like a person's life in miniature. Practical, folded, held together. Outside, the snow kept falling, thread on thread, making the world smaller. Inside, the house exhaled and gathered itself for the hospitality of the night. The apprentices, who had practiced stitches and planes, now practiced a different craft, the art of watching someone be welcomed. The blacksmith filled his pipe of small domestic actions, setting his tools in order for the morning's work, his mind already measuring the mortar and the weight of the post that would need settling. As the kettle began to sing again, and the brazier's embers made a slow decision to glow, the innkeeper stood for a moment with her hand on the Norrin, feeling the weight of stitches and time. The patched cloth swung slightly in the draught from the door, and, in its movement, the brass grommets caught the lantern light like small moons. She remembered the blacksmith's words about embers, and the elder's about the seam of the house. In the pocket of her apron she kept a spare hook and a scrap of paper with a name she had yet to write. A child in the next room coughed softly, then settled. The stranger set his parcel down, and, with the kind of small gratitude that gathers into larger things over time, said, "Thank you." The innkeeper inclined her head and gestured toward the kettle. There was a moment, thin as a shaving of wood, when all those small lives rested in a single breath. The brazier, the Norrin, the dream of sturdier wood, and the metal that waited to be shaped. The night would hold other things yet. There were plans for the morning, a trip to fetch stone, more coal, perhaps the blacksmith's help to fashion a brace for the post. But the house, for now, held a stranger. The apprentices rearranged their needles and thimbles, deciding which to bring to the morning's work and which to leave. The elder set his jar of pickles closer to the guest, as if to underline the hospitality with food. Outside, on the verge of the lane, the blacksmith paused and looked to the south where the road dimmed. His forge had been quiet for hours, tending embers rather than doorways. Yet he felt, as craftsmen sometimes do, the urge to go and touch the place where the earth met the post. He did not leave. He stayed and brewed a small cup of tea, the smell of iron still clinging to his fingers like a second skin. He checked the hooks he had made, and smiled to himself at the even bend of one. Inside, as the inn settled, hands relaxed, and conversation thinned to the low, steady hum of domestic life. The apprentice who had been plane-shaving finally allowed themselves to lean back and watch the cat undulate into sleep. The Norrin swung, the patch catching a light that seemed to say the house could keep its people. The innkeeper moved among them, a human center of quiet decisions, and made one more check of the door latch. Some repairs, she knew, were not just about wood and thread. They were about the tender economy that kept a place habitable. A neighbor arriving with a jar of pickles, a blacksmith passing along a hook, apprentices learning through the apprenticeship of failures and successes. Tonight's mending was both act and lesson. She turned to the brazier and fed it a single coal, watching the ember reopen like an eye. For a moment she thought of the blacksmith's comment, dying embers and patience, and felt the thread of it run through the room. There were always embers to warm next evening's hands. There were always planks waiting for a fit. She smoothed the Norrin with a palm, and, as if in acknowledgment, the stranger unwrapped his parcel and set it on his knee, revealing nothing of consequence at first glance. A small, worn book, its edges salted with damp, and a cloth-wrapped thing that might be bread. The apprentices leaned in as if the parcel might be a new sort of lesson. The elder hummed. Outside, the snow lay thicker, muting the lane until it felt as though the inn was afloat in white air. The house kept its light steady, a warm center for those who trusted its hearth. At the window, a single ember winked and went out, and beneath that quiet loss, the blacksmith's breath was steady. He looked over the Norrin toward the stranger, and saw, perhaps, not a story, but the beginning of one. Threads crossing, small tasks ahead, the weight of a plank that would need writing. He rolled his palms together, feeling the soft grit from iron filings, and then he set the metal cup into the brazier to warm. The sound of a hammer being laid aside was followed by a silence the room could wear easily. The night kept to itself a little longer. Then footsteps approached again, this time quieter, measured, like someone half hesitating at the margin of the inn's light. The innkeeper glanced toward the door, her fingers still smelling faintly of glue and wood, and caught the passage of someone about to enter or retreat. The brazier's glow made her face soft in the lantern light. She did not look surprised. She had known, in a way that only those who mind houses do, that thresholds call and respond. She stepped to the doorway once more, and the shadow at the step resolved into a shape that had been on the edge all evening. One of the apprentices returning from a brief errand, cheeks rubbed raw by wind. The apprentice paused at the sight of the stranger, and then, with the innocent solemnity that makes small towns move, bowed slightly, offering a simple "Welcome." The stranger's reply was a look that seemed to contain a story the room did not yet have the patience to hear. It was a look that signaled both relief and a continuing weariness. The innkeeper closed the door against the cold, and heard, in the wood, the small, contented groan of a thing settling into its purpose. The Norrin's patched panel lay between them like a promise. The Ngawa plank underfoot held true. The brazier's embers breathed a steady, dim glow. They would begin the foundation work at dawn. For all the evening's mending, the larger task remained, to set the post on firmer ground so the Ngawa would not sigh again. The blacksmith had already sketched, with a piece of coal, the curve of an iron brace that might be fitted to bind the post without scarring the wood. The apprentice who had stitched the Norrin wanted to practice the final seam under daylight. The elder, claiming he needed a cigarette and a short walk, stood and stretched with the sort of deliberation that meant he would be first at sunrise. The innkeeper took the key from its hook and turned it slowly in her hand, as if turning over the night itself. She felt the soft weight of responsibility, and the small thrill that comes when a house is given both challenge and company. The stranger at her hearth had arrived with winter on his cloak and a parcel that might be bread and a book. His presence had paradoxically widened the room, made it hold more air. She closed the door, but not fully. There was still the sound of the lane beyond, faint and sibilant with falling snow. The brazier sent up a fold of smoke, and the blacksmith, who had been tending the iron hooks, caught the movement and smiled without comment. The apprentices gathered their things, each with a small pocket of tools, and the elder arranged his jar of pickles where the stranger might reach for it in the night. There was a readiness to the house now that felt like a held breath, a community poised between repair and rest, between the day's small labors and the morrow's larger ones. Outside, the onsen's steam braided with the evening fog. The lantern light washed the Norrin in golden hue. The Ngawa held the secret of a plank that would be righted come morning. The blacksmith's hearth, which had huddled at the margin of the inn's life like a kindly sentinel, had provided both metal and counsel, a calmness that made the apprentice's dreams of steel feel less like a far-off myth and more like a reachable craft. Within the hush, someone moved to the brazier and poked at the embers, as if to remind them that they could be coaxed to flame again, that strength can be regathered. The sound was small but decisive. The innkeeper folded her hands and, for a moment, let herself imagine the morning. The post set upon a firmer stone, the Norrin swinging straight, apprentices with hands still warm from mending. She felt gratitude like a soft garment around her shoulders. The stranger settled deeper into his seat, the book on his knee like a small altar. He did not speak of where he had come from or of the path that sent him to their door. Such stories, when they arrive at the hearth, prefer to be coaxed out slowly, like embers coaxed into flame. Outside, snow fell with more insistence, and the world narrowed to the house's warm lantern circle. Inside, the innkeeper walked once more through the rooms, checking the futons, setting a kettle for the night in case thirst woke anyone, pausing to smooth the Norrin, to run a hand across the Ngawa where the new plank met the old, with a seam that had been made by care. The apprentices watched her, learning not only measurements and technique, but also the economy of attention a house requires. When she returned to the table, the blacksmith tapped the anvil with the pad of his mallet, a single, steady note that seemed to file the air into something useful. He met the innkeeper's eyes, and, in that brief look, both acknowledged the night and the work ahead. He took a small scrap of paper from his pocket, an order for coal perhaps, or a note for a brace. and set it by his cup like a talisman. They let the kitchen settle into a dim quiet. The lantern light softened. The cat stretched and took up a new nest of shavings. The brazier's embers made a steady, low-breathing sound, and the inn exhaled as though satisfied by a day's small labors. There was comfort in the routine. Comfort not because the world was easy, but because the house was tended. A clock in a neighbor's home chimed 3 low notes, and, far off, the onsen's steam sighed as if content. The stranger closed his book and, handing the innkeeper the parcel's cloth, said, "For your kind, only a little." Inside the cloth was, indeed, a small loaf of bread and a scrap of cloth, both humble things and both given with an honest hand. The elder accepted them with a nod and set the bread by the pickles as if to balance flavors with gratitude. The apprentices lay out their tools for the morning, folding cloth around planes and thimbles like gifts. Their dreams of steel, the vague, patient aspiration to shape metal as surely as the blacksmith, felt nearer for the night. The blacksmith's hands, bearing the memory of the anvil's note, found a pattern in the way the light hit the brass grommets. Small moons, fixed to the Norren like anchors. Outside, a faint sound came from the lane. Footsteps far down, a figure passing whose presence was merely another mark in the night's ledger. Inside, the house settled into its arrangement of warmth and shadow. The innkeeper made one more round, checking every latch, noticing the way the Norren's patched seam caught the last of the lantern light and threw it back as if proud. She listened to the ngawa, which gave a soft, satisfied creak when she walked it. Somewhere in the corner, the younger apprentice whispered to the elder about the practice they had done, and how their stitch still skewed slightly. The elder responded with a half-laugh and a sharp, kind correction that turned the whisper into a lesson. The blacksmith, watching from his cup of cooling tea, said nothing, and yet offered the apprentices his most valuable currency, the humility of his example. As the night thickened, the innkeeper sat by the brazier and put her hands above the last warm eye of coal. The embers' glow painted her palms in a soft, honest light. She thought, simply and without flourish, that the house was kept by people who practiced care. Repair, she knew, was not a single act, but a habit, a communal rhythm. Embers die and are rekindled. Planks settle and are raised again. Norrens tear and are mended. So it goes, she thought, and felt a small satisfaction that the room was full with the deliberate joy of doing good and useful things. A single knock sounded again at the door, more insistent this time, as if the road could not leave the house alone. The innkeeper felt the house listen. She stood and brushed her hands, and for a moment the brazier's dying ember caught the movement and flared like an answering nod. She moved toward the Norren, the patched seam swaying at her side, the brass grommets catching the lantern light as small, modest moons. The threshold awaited, and, beyond it, the night kept its counsel. The knock came again, patient now, but insistent enough that the innkeeper felt its presence like a pebble in a pocket. She stepped through the warm pool of lantern light and pushed the Norren aside. The snow outside glittered with the first pale promises of morning, and someone stood under the eaves, holding a slab of something flat and heavy wrapped in oiled cloth. It was the gardener, cheeks flushed, small steam wreathing from his collar. He had found a flagstone at the edge of his patch. Too small for his path, he said, but exactly what a post might rest upon. He did not stay long. Practical hands do not loiter where others work. He passed the stone into the innkeeper's waiting palms with a quiet, "It'll keep the wood off the damp." The stone made a low sound against her palm and felt like promise. She thanked him with a smile that was both economy and warmth. He shifted his boots, nodded to the blacksmith who stood near the brazier, and left like someone who had both given and taken a good measure. The lane swallowed his footfalls. Steam braided into the morning, and the world shrank to the steady business of the house. They rose before the sun, as they had said they would. The lanterns were coaxed into a low glow, and the kettle was set. This time, the steam that came from it appeared delicate enough to stitch the cold back into the walls. The apprentice who had returned from the errand tied his scarf with a new patience, and came to stand where the Ngawa met the snow. He watched the post with the sort of attentive silence apprentices learn to wear at dawn. Not idle, not impatient, simply present to the work that calls for steady feet and steady hands. They began, as craftsmen do, by making space. The elder fetched a small shovel, and together they cleared around the post, brushing away the winter's soft press until the base was visible. Soil came up as damp black and smelling faintly of leaf mold. They saved the loam, setting it to one side in a woven basket for later tamping. The apprentice with the plane carried the plank to be set aside, and the blacksmith, with the mallet at his belt and soot still in the lines of his palms, bent to show the younger how to check the post's grain, where rot might sleep and where a clean cut could find purchase. They did not seek heroics in the lift. 2 men and 2 apprentices, a neighbor with a stone, a plank levered with rope and the steady patience of muscle, raised the post the fraction required to slip a flagstone under its base. The blacksmith put his shoulder to a crowbar, and the wood squirmed like something that had been asleep and was half rising. The stone slid in with a dull, comforting sound, and for a long half-breath everyone felt the post sit differently. The Ngawa, no longer dangling on a tired sigh, received the plank's replacement with a small, satisfied creak. But the housekeeper's eye had caught a small movement at the joint. The post wanted to shift when the ground beyond its base gave. They needed more than one stone and a shift. The post wanted to be held, to be made stubborn against the damp that would always wish to shift it. The blacksmith took from his leather bag a length of iron he had hammered into a strap the night before, folding its edges under and punching small holes along its span. He warmed the iron at the brazier, this time with purpose, not theater, and hammered it against the anvil until it sat like a curve that meant business. Sparks were few and modest. The heat was a patient red, the sort that makes metal obey without boasting. He threaded the strap beneath the post where it met the Ngawa and bent it snugly to the frame, shaping it with a slow, sure rhythm of hammer and anvil. The apprentices watched as the iron changed under blows, the shape of a brace emerging that would hold the post to the frame without needing to bury the wood in nails that would split and leach. He drilled little pilot holes, done with a brace and bit, and with brass pins, too small to be showy and large enough for purpose, he fastened the strap. The brass gleamed faintly against the iron's black and the wood's pale grain like punctuation. The process taught them more than technique. The elder stood back and sipped his tea, and then, in his manner of small sermons, he said, "Metal learns from heat what wood learns from time." It was not a grand truth, but the kind that does its work in a room. A proverb that unknotted a question in an apprentice's mind. The younger looked from the strap to the post to the blacksmith's hands, and felt a quiet unrolling inside him, an understanding that one material yields to a different care, that iron's obedience to heat is a kind of pact, They packed the stone with earth and small pebbles, tamping and sliding until the post no longer threatened to shift. The blacksmith hammered a final pin, and the strap sighed into its place. When the Ngawa board was set and tested, it did not just creak. It gave a harmonic that sounded fuller, like a room taking on another voice. An apprentice walked its length, listening, and grinned. "It sings," he said, as if announcing some small miracle. The blacksmith only nodded. He had no hunger for praise. His satisfaction was found in the straight sound of well-aligned timber. At the Norren, there were finishing touches to be made. The apprentices gathered around the patched seam, pressing the washi and waiting for the rice starch paste to hold with the patient weight of air. The blacksmith's hooks, cooled and brushed, were lined along the table, small moons ready to take their place. The innkeeper threaded the rod through the Norren, balancing the patched panel so it fell straight. She asked the blacksmith to set one last hook, to make sure the Norren would not sag with the first rainy evening. He took the hook to the anvil, narrowed one end with a few taps, and threaded a thin leather thong through the hole. He tied it with a knot that announced itself as both secure and easy to undo, because the house sometimes demanded changes that a stubborn knot would deny. The hook set with a clean little sound when he hammered it into the wooden header. It sat flush, a small piece of steel that would see many suns. The apprentice who had been most absorbed in the stitches requested to try the final seam. She worked with a kind of quiet fury, fingers quick and softer now, and the thread, waxed, taut, caught the light like faint veinings and drew the patch to its place. Her stitch was a visible line across the Norren, honest and plain. The elder leaned in and, with a small, pleased noise, tapped the fabric as if testing a bowl for doneness. "It will keep out the draught," he declared in his small way, which everyone accepted as encapsulating the evening's labor. There was time to step back and measure what they had accomplished, what had been made tool, and what had been made belonging. The stranger, who had slept fitfully through the later hours, and had been careful not to be a further weight on the house, rose at dawn with the rest of them, and moved shyly near the doorway. He had come for warmth and stayed for the quiet. Now he watched as the group pressed the last and smallest neatnesses into place. The innkeeper offered him a slice of the remaining bread and a small cup of tea. He accepted, and, with the modest gratitude that had been true before, said, "I will leave what I can." He set down the parcel on the low shelf and produced a coin, small and cold from the pocket. They would have none of it pressed as charity. The elder laughed and put the coin instead into the collection box at the counter, then signed it, no words needed, into being part of their story. The stranger smiled with something corrected in him, as if the act of giving made the journey tidy again. The apprentices, emboldened, asked him about his travels. He replied in simple, measured sentences about lanes and inns, and the crust of bread in a pocket that becomes precious. His voice, low and worn, fit into the morning the way a bell fits a hand. There was a small pause as the blacksmith took the signal of the morning and stepped to the brazier to cough the ash off his hammer. The coal's face made a slow, steady choice to burn brighter when fed. He dropped a small piece and the ember reopened like an eye. The apprentices watched his fingers for the way they moved. One of them reached out and took up the tongs, feeling their weight as if testing a future hand. The blacksmith closed his fingers and let the apprentice hold them for a moment as a teaching that required no sentence. He handed the tongs back, and the boy's face had that mineral sheen happiness can give. Something like a promise under the skin. The morning meal was quiet, full of the sound of spoons and the small clinks of shared bowls. Outside, the onsen steamed a small, honest cloud that made the lane a softened line of shadow and light. The apprentices put down their chopsticks and, as if completing a ritual, took their tools and readied them for the morning's final tasks. The post to be bedded, the last sash to be tightened, the anvil's small rack to be set on its stand. Each movement was tidy, almost ceremonious, but without fuss. They had learnt that ritual is not always spectacle but habit. Before the larger task of foundation work resumed, the elder produced from his coat a scrap of paper and a stub of charcoal. He drew, in simple strokes, the idea that had been threaded through the night. A strap and a wedge and a stone, how they might marry wood and earth so that next winter would see less sagging and more singing. He labeled nothing because he had no need. Those present understood what he meant. The blacksmith took the sketch and smudged a line with a finger that had known many holds. "We will fashion a short brace," he said. "It need not be pretty, it only must be faithful." The apprentices nodded, as if the word faithful were a tool they could use. They worked that morning with a rhythm the room recognized. Measure, cut, heat, hold, hammer, test. The blacksmith heated a strip of iron until the color changed to the exact warmed brown that tells a craftsman the metal will bend where he asks it. He bent the strap, cut and filed the edges smooth so they would not abrade the post's surface, and punched holes to take pins. When it came to fastening, he used small brass pins, whose gentle gleam the innkeeper liked for the way they would weather in time without rusting too fiercely. The apprentices took turns at the set. One steadied the board, while another tightened the pin until the strap hugged the wood as though it were an old friend. At a pause, the elder brought out the jar of pickles and a small dish of miso soup, and they ate under the slatted sun that leaked through the norin. The conversation was soft and plain, about grain, about coal prices this season, about a child's exam that the gardener fretted over. For a moment it might have seemed like nothing, but this was the weave of community. Practicalities threaded with small confidences, the exchange of food folded like a stitch into care. The stranger, perhaps feeling less like a guest and more like a companion, stood and offered to help fetch more pebbles for packing. The blacksmith declined the offer with a small laugh, but accepted his company in carrying a bag of lime. The stranger's hands were warmed by carrying rather than shaping. Yet, even in that, the elders and the apprentices saw belonging being formed. One who gives his time is already part of the pattern. The final test came when the apprentice who had been planer found a place to set his shoulder and lift, while the blacksmith braced the strap and hammered the last pin. The post no longer gave under pressure. It instead resisted in a way that felt reliable, like an answer from an old friend. The Ngawa board was placed, and the sound it made when crossed was a firmer note, a chord they had tuned together. The norin swung and did not snag. The hook the blacksmith had formed earlier bore the weight with a little huming satisfaction, and when the innkeeper slid the rod through, the patched panel rested level and true. They cleaned their tools in the basin, oiling the plane, wiping the mallet, returning the anvil to its stand. The apprentices arranged their needles and linen, and watched as the elder wrapped the remaining pickles in paper to be delivered to a neighbor later. Small tokens exchanged to keep trust in circulation. The blacksmith, his forearms still dusted with soot, took a moment to sharpen his hammer's face, not in a ritual of vanity, but to make sure the next day's notes would hold a clean tone. There was laughter, quietly offered, when the cat decided the best test of the plank was to stride across with arrogant grace and then to flop down to sleep with a satisfied purr. The innkeeper called it auditioning, and the apprentices tittered as if they had observed some fine judgment. Even the stranger smiled, the line of worry easing from his face like mist burnt off by sun. Before leaving, the stranger stood at the threshold. He had settled a small debt, left the coin, and now he took from his pocket a scrap of paper and folded it so carefully that the crease looked like someone recalling a habit of order. The inked words were brief, and when he placed them on the counter, they read like a kiss of thanks. A note that said simply, "For a warm night and a steady hearth." The elder accepted it with a nod, and in the pocket of his shirt stored the small paper as one would store a receipt for kindness. He lingered a moment longer, watching the Noren and the Ngawa, and then slipped his cloak about him and stepped out into the lane where the onsen made the air thick and forgiving. The snow took him in, and the lane erased his prints in minutes. The house held its light steady, and the lanterns reflected in soft pools on the path. The apprentices watched him go, their eyes bright with the kind of attention that becomes the memory of a place. When the door was closed and latched for the second time, the innkeeper turned and looked at the room. It had the peculiar, lovely hush of things finished well. Tools arranged, wood oiled, fabric mended. She moved to the brazier and ran her palms above the last, patient ember. It warmed the skin in a way that felt intimate and ordinary. She thought of the blacksmith's phrase, "Dying embers are only waiting for patience," and found in it a reflection of their own labors, that most things required time as much as skill, a waiting that was active and deliberate. They sat then to share a small bowl of soup and to smoke a little, the elder's broken cigarette lit in a neat economy of use. Conversation drew close and domestic. Plans for the next day, an invitation to the gardener for a kettle of tea, the apprentice who wanted to try the blacksmith's forge under close supervision. The blacksmith, who had not been given to grand instructions, simply said, "Come when it's warm. Watch, then try," which the apprentices took as a permission and a gauntlet all at once. Before the day changed into the more urgent light, the innkeeper stood and took up the Noren with both hands, feeling the weight of the new seam. The patches and the brass grommets caught a bar of sun as it moved across the papered window, and for an instant it looked less like a repaired cloth and more like a map of the house's life. Her fingers smoothed a corner, and the action felt ceremonial, as if she were blessing what they had made with the ordinary tenderness of hands. There was a short exchange before the blacksmith left for his shed, a hand to the innkeeper's shoulder, a nod of mutual recognition. "If there is need for iron again," he said, in a voice that was plain and practical, "send me a note." He did not say much more. His work, like his speech, was composed of small commitments. The morning settled into an easy noon. The apprentices filed their names in the register of the house, and then, as a last task, wrapped the Noren's spare stitching and labeled the tin of brass grommets with the elder's neat scrawl. A child from next door darted in to say hello, a bright flake in miniature, and demanded a story of the night's small repairs. The elder, obliging, told a short one about a stitch that had saved a cloak and a man who had noticed it. The child listened, eyes wide, and then ran off to tell the news down the lane. When the last cup was washed and put away, and the cat had chosen a new patch of sunlight to stretch into, they gathered again briefly at the table. The innkeeper took the small scrap of paper the stranger had left and read the note again, slower, like a person tasting something soft. She folded it and placed it in her pocket. The house hummed with the sound of routine. Distant voices over the onsen's steam, the occasion creak of a shutter at some neighbor's house. But inside there was a warm center, a chorus of small items made right. Before they dispersed, the innkeeper walked the rooms once more, a keeper's inspection that was half affection. She paused at each futon, smoothing a corner, adjusting a pillow. She ran a thumb across the Norrin's seam. She reached without thinking for the brazier, and coaxed a small ember to top up the kettle for the next guest who might arrive in the evening. She thought of the apprentice's hands and the blacksmith's patient strikes, and felt a steadiness settle like a mantle. They left tasks folded away as one does with laundry, neatly, respectfully. The last apprentice closed the shed door and left the blacksmith to his quiet. The elder fetched his jar and, with a wave that was at once a farewell and a promise to return, made his way down the lane. The gardener reappeared to fetch a forgotten bundle and paused to admire the Norrin as if he had not seen it before. The way it hung now made him whistle softly. The stranger had walked beyond the edge of their sight, his prints already melting, and yet his presence had been woven into the morning like an extra stitch. Later, when the house was quieter, and the afternoon moved like a slow hand across the page, the innkeeper sat by the window with a cup of cooling tea. She let the warmth of it fill her palms, while the Norrin swung gently in the thin breath that came through. The blacksmith's hearth, which had begun the evening with dying embers, had by now given them a strap and a neat row of hooks and a lesson that the apprentices would carry. His small forge sat like a second heart in the yard, quiet and assured. She allowed herself then a soft musing about the phrase that had come to sit in the room. Dying embers and dreams of steel. The embers were literal. Coal that must be tended, given breath when needed, gathered in small cups to warm fingers. The dreams of steel were also literal. The apprentices who watched the hammer bend iron, whose palms would soon carry tongs, and whose work would shape hooks and straps. But more than that, they were a domestic imagination. The hope that skill can be learned and repeated. That small acts of repair add up to a house that keeps. When evening fell again, the inn took on the familiar hush of steadiness. Lanterns were lit, and the Norrin stayed where it should, its patch a proud seam. The apprentices, now with the smell of iron and wood in their hair, sat at the table and spoke about what they might practice the following week. A simple hook, learning to bend a small bracket, how to punch a hole in metal without error. Their dreams were modest and precise, the sort that do not shout but that labor toward competence. The innkeeper moved through the house one last time, turning each lock and testing each latch. She paused at the brazier and fed it not to make flame but to tickle a last glow into being, a courtesy to the small birds of warmth that kept them working. She breathed in the smell of iron and tea and warm wood, and thought of all the thin, repeated actions that made the night into a shelter. Before she extinguished the lanterns, she stepped outside once more. The lane was quieter than before. Snow had smoothed a few more footprints. The Norrin caught the lantern light and threw it back in a soft, warm aperture. She rested her hand upon the fabric and, in that small contact, felt the imprint of all the hands that had held it. The brass grommets had the faint shine of use. The seam had the subtle relief of stitches done by hands learning to trust themselves. She closed the door finally and turned the key in its hook. The sound was low and final. Inside, The house settled into its breathing. A small rise and fall of heat, the faint tick of wires and wood finding their place in temperature. She sat for a moment with the kettle's last whisper, and then, with a lightness that belonged more to habit than to ceremony, she invited those present to take one slow breath with her, an inhale that filled the chest like the scent of coal, an exhale that let the tension of doing fall away. Breathe in, she thought, as if speaking to each of them. Hold, just for a beat. Breathe out and let what has been done rest. The apprentices obeyed without words, letting a quiet wash of ease pass through them. The blacksmith, in the corner near the anvil, closed his eyes for a single second, as if to feel the metal in the silence between hammer strikes. The elder smiled in a way that showed he had not been sleeping, but had been listening all along. The house hummed then in a low, contented tenor. The Norrin swung with the last of the evening's breath. The Ngawa, with its newly settled plank and iron strap, lay underfoot like a well-told secret. The brazier's embers, no longer threatening, sat like small moons in a bed of ash, waiting for the next attention. Apprentices' dreams of steel, no longer remote, felt as if they might soon be names and dates and strap designs tucked into their pockets. Outside, the onsen's steam braided with the cool night, and somewhere a bell chimed the hour without urgency. The innkeeper stood by the hearth and thought of the small ledger of nights like this. Nights when a torn fabric was sewn, a plank lifted, a stranger given bread and shelter, and a community practiced the slow architecture of care. She felt gratitude like a worn shawl, warm, familiar, and easy to fold when the morning came. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat and let herself imagine the blacksmith's forge in the coming weeks. Apprentices warming their palms on tongs, the sound of small hammers on an anvil falling into their bones, the steady accumulation of skill. The phrase returned in her mind without flourish. Dying embers and dreams of steel. It held the hush and the vow. It held the work they would keep doing, a little at a time. If this evening soothed you, a quiet follow helps us share more nights like this. She put the kettle on the brazier once more, only a cup for the early riser, and then turned the light low. The cat slid from the futon to the chair and made itself into a warm knot. The apprentices, having folded cloths and sharpened blades, drifted to rest. The blacksmith took up his hammer one last time, not for necessity, but for the pleasure of a clean strike. It sounded like a note that made wood and iron agree. As the house breathed and the embers dimmed into a patient, watchful coal, the innkeeper sat and thought of the small seam of days ahead. The work that would call back to this night. The neighbor who would ask for a hook. The apprentice who would return to the forge. She felt a soft assurance in the knowledge that repair would continue, that the house would be kept by hands that had learned to be gentle and exact. When the last light was put away, the Norrin hung still in the doorway, and in the shadow of its seam, the brass grommets caught a sliver of moonlight like tiny stars. The Ngawa held the sound of a plank that would not betray a foot, and the brazier's final ember made the room lamp-like for a single, private moment. She closed her eyes and let the hush carry her toward sleep, the rhythm of the house steadying and true. Outside, the snow continued its soft work, and the onsen breathed its whisper. Inside, the blacksmith's hearth kept a sleeping warmth, dying embers that had been coaxed, and dreams of steel that, in the slow economy of apprenticeship, would become the quiet craft of many hands. The inn exhaled. It was, for the time being, well kept.